Welcome back to Cosmic and Body Horror. Join us on a journey through this collection of 5 stories from old, dusty horror pulp magazines. I have added a timestamp for each story in the video description. Egocentric Orbit by Cory.
Near the end of his 15th orbit, as Greenland slipped by noiselessly below, he made the routine measurements that tested the operation of his space capsule and checked the automatic instruments which would transmit their stored data to Earth on his next pass over Control. Everything normal, all mechanical devices were operating perfectly. This information didn't surprise him. In fact, he really didn't even think about it. The previous orbits and the long simulated flights on Earth during training had made such checks routine and perfect results expected. The capsules were developed by exhaustive testing both on the ground and as empty satellites before entrusting them to carry animals, and then the first human. He returned to contemplation of the panorama passing below and above, although, as he noted idly, above and below had lost some of their usual meaning. Since his capsule, like all heavenly bodies, was stable in position with respect to the entire universe, and thanks to Sir Isaac Newton and his laws, never changed, the Earth and the stars alternated over his head during each orbit. Up now meant whatever was in the direction of his head. He remembered that even during his initial orbit, when the Earth first appeared overhead, he accepted the fact as normal. He wondered if the other two had accepted it as easily, for there had been 2 men hurled into orbit before he ventured into space. 2 others, who had also passed the rigorous 3-year training period and were selected on the basis of overall performance to precede him. He had known them both well and wondered again what had happened on their flights. Of course, they had both returned, depending upon what your definition of return was. The capsules in which they had ventured beyond Earth had returned them living, but this was to be expected, for even the considerable hazards of descent through the atmosphere and the terrible heating which occurred were successfully surmounted by the capsule. Naturally, it had not been expected that the satellites would have to be brought down by command from the ground. But this too was part of the careful planning. Radio control of the retro rockets that moved the satellite out of orbit by reducing its velocity. Of course, ground control was to be used only if the astronaut failed to ignite the retro rockets himself. He remembered everyone's surprise and relief when the first capsule was recovered and its occupant found to be alive. They had assumed that, in spite of all precautions, he was dead because he had not fired the rockets on the 50th orbit, and it was necessary to bring him down on the 65th. Recovery, alive, only partially solved the mystery, for the rescuers and all others were met by a haughty, stony silence from the occupant. Batteries of tests confirmed an early diagnosis, complete and utter withdrawal, absolute refusal to communicate. Therapy was unsuccessful. The second attempt was similar in most respects, except that command return was made on the 31st orbit after the astronaut's failure to deorbit at the end of the 30th. His incoherent babble of moons, stars, and worlds was no more helpful than the first test aim after test, confirmed that no obvious organic damage had been incurred by exposure outside of the Earth's protective atmosphere. Biopsy of even selected brain tissues seemed to show that microscopic cellular changes due to prolonged weightlessness or primary cosmic ray bombardment, which had been suggested by some authorities, were unimportant. Somewhat reluctantly, it was decided to repeat the experiment a 3rd time. The launching was uneventful. He was sent into space with the precision he expected. The experience was exhilarating, and although he had anticipated each event in advance, he could not possibly have foreseen the overpowering feeling that came over him. Weightlessness he had experienced for brief periods during training, but nothing could match the heady impression of continuous freedom from gravity. Earth passing overhead was also to be expected from the simple laws of celestial mechanics, but his feeling as he watched it now was inexpressible. It occurred to him that perhaps this was indeed why he was here, because he could appreciate such experiences best. He had been told the stars would be bright, unblinking, and an infinitude in extent. But could mere descriptions or photographs convey the true seeing? On his 21st orbit, he completed his overseeing the entire surface of the planet in daylight. He had seen more of Earth than anyone able to tell about it, but only he had the true feeling of it. The continents were clearly visible, as were the oceans and both polar ice caps. The shapes were familiar, but in only a remote way. A vague indistinctness born of distance served to modify the outlines, and he alone was seeing and understanding. On the dark side of the planet, large cities were marked by indistinct light areas which paled to insignificance compared to the stars and his sun. He speculated about the others who had only briefly experienced these sights. Undoubtedly, they weren't as capable of fully grasping or appreciating any of these things as he was. It was quite clear that no one else but he could encompass the towering feeling of power and importance generated by being alone in the universe.
End of Egocentric Orbit by Cory. The Feeling by Roger D. Aycock. Galaxy Magazine, April 1961.
If this story holds true in real practice, it may reveal something about us that we've never known. We're just starting on the first one, Walraven, ship's communications man, Costain said, low-voiced. Captain Maxon and Vaughan have called in. There's been no word from Ragan. Corps Irwin took his seat beside the psychologist, his bearing as militarily authoritative, in spite of civilian clothing, as the room's air was medical. Maybe Ragan won't turn up, Irwin said. Maybe we've still got a man out there to bring the ship back. Costain made a quieting gesture, his eyes on the three-man psych team grouped about Walraven's wheeled reclining chair. They've given Walraven a light somnolent, not enough to put him out, just enough to make him relive the flight in detail accurately. The lead sight man killed the room's lighting to a glow. Lieutenant Walraven, the ship is ready. You are at your post, with Captain Maxon and Lieutenants Vaughan and Ragan. The first Mars flight is about to blast off. How do you feel? Walraven lay utterly relaxed, his face dreaming. His voice had the waning sound of a tape running down for lack of power. Jumpy, he said, but not really afraid. We're too well conditioned for that. I guess this is a big thing, an important thing. Exciting. It had been exciting at first, the long preparation over, training and study and news interviews and final parties, all dreamlike and part of the past. Outside, now invisible but hearteningly present beyond the ship's impermeable hull, the essential and privileged people waiting to see them off. The ship's power plant was humming gently like a giant patient captain. Maxon passed out muscle relaxant capsules. The total boneless relaxation that was their defense against acceleration came quickly. The ship was 2 hours out beyond lunar orbit and still accelerating when trained for months against the moment set each about his task. Readings occupied Maxon and Vaughan and Ragan, while Walraven checked his communications and telemetering gear. It was not until the transmitter slot had licked up its first coded tape, no plain text here, security before even safety, and reported all well, the predicted borne out, that they became aware of the feeling. The four of them sat in their unsqueaking gimbaled seats and looked at each other, sharing the feeling and knowing that they shared it, but not why. Vaughan, who was given to poetry and some degree of soul-searching, made the first open recognition. There is something wrong, he said. The others agreed, and, agreeing, could add nothing of explanation to the wrongness. Time passed while they sat seeing within themselves for the answer. And if not for answer, at least for identification. But nothing came and nothing changed, except that with time, the steady pressure of the feeling grew stronger. Vaughan again was first to react to the pressure. "We've got to do something." He twisted out of his seat and wavered in the small pseudo-gravity of the ship's continuing acceleration. "I've never in my life felt so desolate, so—" He stopped. "There aren't any words," he said helplessly. Less articulate than Vaughan, and knowing it, the others did not try to help find the words. Only Reagan, professional soldier, without family or close tie anywhere in the world, had a suggestion. "The ship's power plant is partly psionic," Reagan said. "I don't understand the principle, but it's been drilled into us that no other system can give a one-directional thrust without reaction. The psi drive is tied into our minds in the same way it's tied into the atomic and electronic components. It's part of us, and we're part of it." Even Maxon, crew authority on the combination drive, missed his meaning at first. "If our atomic shielding fails," Reagan explained, "we're irradiated. If our psionics bank fails, we may feel anything. Maybe the trouble is there." Privately, they disagreed. Certain that nothing so disquieting as the feeling that weighted them down could be induced, even by so cryptic a marriage of dissimilar principles as made up the ship's power plant. Still, it was a possible avenue of relief. "It's worth trying," Maxon said. And they checked, and checked, and checked. "We worked for hours," Walraven said, but nothing came of it. None of us, even Maxon, knew enough about the psi drive to be sure, but we ended up certain that the trouble wasn't there. It was in us. The drug was wearing thin, leaving him pale and shaken. His face had a glisten of sweat under the lowered lights. The lead psych man chose a hypodermic needle, looked to Owen and Costain for authority, and administered a second injection. "You gave up searching," he said. "What then, Lieutenant?" "We waited," Walraven said. He relaxed, his face smoothing to impersonal detachment as his mind slipped back to the ship and its crew. Watching, Costain felt a sudden deep unease, as if the man's mind had really winged back through time and space and carried a part of his own with it. There was only one more possible check, Walraven said. We had to wait 2 days for that. The check was Maxon's idea, simple of execution and unarguable of result. At halfway point, acceleration must cease. The ship rotate on its gyros and deceleration set in. There would be a period of waiting when the power plant must be shut off completely. If the feeling stemmed from the psi drive, it would lift then. It did not lift. They sat weightless and disoriented, while the gyros processed and the ship swung end by end, and the steady pressure of the feeling mounted up and up without relief. "It gets worse every hour," Vaughan said raggedly. "It's not a matter of time," Maxon said. "It's the distance. The feeling grows stronger as we get farther from home." They sat for another time without talk, feeling the distance build up behind them and sensing through the unwindowed hull of the ship what the emptiness outside must be like. The ship was no longer an armored projectile bearing them snugly and swiftly to a first planetfall. It was a walnut shell without strength or direction. In the end, they talked out their problem because there was nothing else they could do. "We're men," Maxon said, not as if he must convince himself, but as if it were a premise that had to be made, a starting point for all logic. "We're reasoning creatures. If the trouble lies in ourselves, we can find its source and its reason for being." He picked Vaughan first, because Vaughan had been first to sense the wrongness, and because the most sensitive link in a chain is also predictably its weakest. "Try," Maxon said. "I know there are no words to describe this thing, but get as close as you can." Vaughan tried. "It isn't homesickness. It's a different thing altogether from nostalgia. It's not just fear, I'm afraid. Not of anything. Just afraid in the way a child is afraid of falling in his dreams when he's really had no experience with falling because he's never fallen more than a few inches in his life. When I think of my wife, it's not the same at all as if I were just in some far corner of the earth, with only land and water between us. Even if I were marooned on an uncharted island somewhere with no hope of seeing home again, I wouldn't feel this way. There wouldn't be this awful pulling. Regan agreed with Vaughan that the feeling was essentially a pull, but beyond agreement could add nothing. Regan had covered the world without forming a tie to hold him. One place was as good as another, and he felt no loss for any particular spot on earth. "I only want to be back there," he said simply. "Anywhere but here." "I was born on a farm in New England," Walraven said. "Out of the land like my father and his people before him. I am part of that land, no matter how far from it I go, because everything I am came from it. I feel uprooted. I don't belong here." Uproot was the key for which they had hunted, Maxon said slowly. "There are wild animals on Earth that can't live away from their natural homes. Insects. How does a termite feel? Cut off from its hive. Maybe that's our trouble. Something bigger than individual men made the human race what it is. Maybe we've been a sort of composite being all along without knowing it, tied together by the need of each other and not able to exist apart. Maybe no one knew it before because no one was ever isolated in the way we are." Walraven had more to say, almost defiant in his earnestness. "This is going to sound wild, but I've been fighting inside myself ever since Vaughan mentioned being pulled toward home. I have the feeling that if I'd only let go, I'd be back where I belong." He snapped his fingers, the sound loud in the room. "Like that." No one laughed because each found in himself the same conviction waiting to be recognized. Regan said, "Walraven's right. There is no place on earth I care for more than another, but I feel I could be back there in any one of them." He snapped his fingers, as Walraven had done. "As quickly as that, I know," Maxon said. "But we can't let go. We were sent out to put this ship into orbit around Mars. We've got to take her there." Walraven said, "It wasn't easy. The feeling got worse as we went out and out. Knowing what it was helped a little, but not enough. We held onto each other, the four of us, to keep the group together. We knew what would happen if we let go." The head psych man looked to Costain and put his needle away when Costain shook his head. The ship coordinator's Irwin said sharply, "Walraven, you did put her into orbit." "Yes," Walraven said. "We put her into orbit and turned on the telemetering equipment. They'll be picking up her signals by now, and then we turned our backs on each other and we let go. There wasn't any feeling of motion or speed, but I felt a fresh breeze on my face, and when I opened my eyes, I was standing beside a familiar stone fence on a hill above the house where I was born. You haven't told me, but the others came back too, didn't they? All but Regan, Irwin said. His tone made Costain think wryly. Even the military can snatch at straws. Maxon and Vaughan called in. But we haven't heard from Regan. He wasn't left behind, Walraven said with certainty. Regan has no family, but he has a home. We're standing on it. An orderly came in with an envelope for Costain, who opened it and handed the paper to Irwin. To Walraven, Costain said, "It's a cablegram from North Ireland. Regan is back." Irwin was still gripping the paper in his hand when he walked with Costain out of the hospital into the bright airiness of a spring day. He glared at the warm blue sky. "We'll find a way," Irwin said. "We've proved that we can put men on Mars with the right conditioning. We can keep them there." "You are a dedicated and resolute man, coordinators," Costain said. "Do you really suppose that any amount of conditioning could fit you to do what those boys failed at?" The long moment of considering that passed before Irwin answered left a fine sheen of sweat on his face. "No," Irwin said.
End of The Feeling by Roger D. Aycock.
The Night Wire by H.F. Arnold, Popular Fiction Publishing Company, 1926. There is something ungodly about these night wire jobs. You sit up here on the top floor of a skyscraper and listen in to the whispers of a civilization. New York, London, Calcutta, Bombay, Singapore. They're your next-door neighbors after the streetlights go dim and the world has gone to sleep. Along in the quiet hours between 2 and 4, the receiving operators doze over their sounders and the news comes in. Fires and disasters and suicides, murders, crowds, catastrophes, sometimes an earthquake with a casualty list as long as your arm. The night wire man takes it down almost in his sleep, picking it off on his typewriter with one finger. Once in a long time you prick up your ears and listen. You've heard of someone you knew in Singapore, Halifax or Paris. Long ago maybe they've been promoted, but more probably they've been murdered or drowned. Perhaps they just decided to quit and took some bizarre way out, made it interesting enough to get in the news. But that doesn't happen often. Most of the time you sit and doze and tap on your typewriter and wish you were home in bed. Sometimes, though, queer things happen. One did the other night, and I haven't got over it yet. I wish I could, you see. I handle the night manager's desk in a western seaport town. What the name is, doesn't matter. There is, or rather was, only one night operator on my staff, a fellow named John Morgan, about 40 years of age, I should say, and a sober, hard-working sort. He was one of the best operators I ever knew, what is known as a double man. That means he could handle 2 instruments at once and type the stories on different typewriters at the same time. He was one of the 3 men I ever knew who could do it consistently, hour after hour, and never make a mistake. Generally, we used only 1 wire at night, but sometimes, when it was late and the news was coming fast, the Chicago and Denver stations would open a 2nd wire, and then Morgan would do his stuff. He was a wizard, a mechanical automatic wizard, which functioned marvelously but was without imagination. On the night of the 16th he complained of feeling tired. It was the first and last time I had ever heard him say a word about himself, and I had known him for 3 years. It was at just 3 o'clock, and we were running only 1 wire. I was nodding over reports at my desk and not paying much attention to him when he spoke. "Jim," he said, "does it feel close in here to you?" "Why, no, John," I answered, "but I'll open a window if you like." "Never mind," he said. "I reckon I am just a little tired." That was all that was said, and I went on working. Every 10 minutes or so I would walk over and take a pile of copy that had stacked up neatly beside his typewriter as the messages were printed out in triplicate. It must have been 20 minutes after he spoke that I noticed he had opened up the other wire and was using both typewriters. I thought it was a little unusual as there was nothing very hot coming in. On my next trip, I picked up the copy from both machines and took it back to my desk to sort out the duplicates. The first wire was running out the usual sort of stuff and I just looked over it hurriedly. Then I turned to the second part of copy. I remember it particularly because the story was from a town I had never heard of, Zebico. Here is the dispatch. I saved a duplicate of it from our files. Zebico, September 16, Sepai Borton. The heaviest mist in the history of the city settled over the town at 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon. All traffic has stopped, and the mist hangs like a pall over everything. Lights of ordinary intensity failed to pierce the fog, which is constantly growing heavier. Scientists here are unable to agree as to the cause, and the local weather bureau states that the like has never occurred before in the history of the city. At 7 p.m. last night, municipal authorities, that was all there was. Nothing out of the ordinary at a bureau headquarters, but, as I say, I noticed the story because of the name of the town. It must have been 15 minutes later that I went over for another batch of copy. Morgan was slumped down in his chair and had switched his green electric light shade so that the gleam missed his eyes and hit only the top of the 2 typewriters. Only the usual stuff was in the right-hand pile, but the left-hand batch carried another story from Zebico. All press dispatches come in takes. meaning that parts of many different stories are strung along together, perhaps with but a few paragraphs of each coming through at a time. This second story was marked Add Fog. Here is the copy. At 7 p.m. the fog had increased noticeably. All lights were now invisible and the town was shrouded in pitch darkness. As a peculiarity of the phenomenon, the fog is accompanied by a sickly odor comparable to nothing yet experienced here. Below that, in customary press fashion, was the hour 3:27 and the initials of the operator, Gem. There was only one other story in the pile from the second wire. Here it is. Second ad, Zebico fog. Accounts as to the origin of the mist differ greatly. Among the most unusual is that of the sexton of the local church, who groped his way to headquarters in a hysterical condition and declared that the fog originated in the village churchyard. It was first visible in the shape of a soft grey blanket clinging to the earth above the graves, he stated. Then it began to rise, higher and higher. A subterranean breeze seemed to blow it in billows, which split up and then joined together again. Fog phantoms, writhing in anguish, twisted the mist into queer forms and figures. And then, in the very thick midst of the mass, something moved. I turned and ran from the accursed spot. Behind me, I heard screams coming from the houses bordering on the graveyard. Although the sexton's story is generally discredited, a party has left to investigate. Immediately after telling his story, the sexton collapsed and is now in a local hospital, unconscious. Queer story, wasn't it? Not that we aren't used to it, for a lot of unusual stories come in over the wire, but for some reason or other, perhaps because it was so quiet that night, the report of the fog made a great impression on me. It was almost with dread that I went over to the waiting piles of copy. Morgan did not move, and the only sound in the room was the tap-tap of the sounders. It was ominous, nerve-wracking. There was another story from Zebico in the pile of copy. I seized on it anxiously. New lead Zebico Fog CP, the rescue party, which went out at 11 p.m. to investigate a weird story of the origin of a fog, which, since late yesterday, has shrouded the city in darkness, has failed to return. Another and larger party has been dispatched. Meanwhile, the fog has, if possible, grown heavier. It seeps through the cracks in the doors and fills the atmosphere with a terribly depressing odor of decay. It is oppressive, terrifying, bearing with it a subtle impression of things long dead. Residents of the city have left their homes and gathered in the local church, where the priests are holding services of prayer. The scene is beyond description. Grown folk and children are alike terrified, and many are almost beside themselves with fear. Mid the wisps of vapor which partially veil the church auditorium, an old priest is praying for the welfare of his flock. The audience alternately wail and cross themselves. From the outskirts of the city may be heard cries of unknown voices. They echo through the fog in queer, uncadenced minor keys. The sounds resemble nothing so much as wind whistling through a gigantic tunnel. But the night is calm and there is no wind. The second rescue party mourn. I am a calm man, and never in a dozen years spent with the wires have been known to become excited, but despite myself, I rose from my chair and walked to the window. Could I be mistaken? Or far down in the canyons of the city beneath me did I see a faint trace of fog? Pshaw! It was all imagination. In the press room, the click of the sounders seemed to have raised the tempo of their tune. Morgan alone had not stirred from his chair. His head sunk between his shoulders, he tapped the dispatches out on the typewriters with one finger of each hand. He looked asleep. Maybe he was, but no, endlessly, efficiently. The two machines rattled off, line after line, as relentless and effortless as death itself. There was something about the monotonous movement of the typewriter keys that fascinated me. I walked over and stood behind his chair, reading over his shoulder the type as it came into being, word by word. Ah, here was another. Flash. Zepico Sipi. There will be no more bulletins from this office. The impossible has happened. No messages have come into this room for 20 minutes. We are cut off from the outside and even the streets below us. I will stay with the wire until the end. It is the end indeed. Since 4 p.m. yesterday, the fog has hung over the city. Following reports from the sexton of the local church, 2 rescue parties were sent out to investigate conditions on the outskirts of the city. Neither party has ever returned, nor was any word received from them. It is quite certain now that they will never return. From my instrument, I can gaze down on the city beneath me. From the position of this room on the 13th floor, nearly the entire city can be seen. Now I can see only a thick blanket of blackness, where customarily are lights and life. I fear greatly that the wailing cries heard constantly from the outskirts of the city are the death cries of the inhabitants. They are constantly increasing in volume and are approaching the center of the city. The fog yet hangs over everything. If possible, it is even heavier than before, but the conditions have changed. Instead of an opaque, impenetrable wall of odorous vapor, now swirls and writhes a shapeless mass in contortions of almost human agony. Now and again the mass parts, and I catch a brief glimpse of the streets below. People are running to and fro, screaming in despair. A vast bedlam of sound flies up to my window, and above all is the immense whistling of unseen and unfelt winds. The fog has again swept over the city, and the whistling is coming closer and closer. It is now directly beneath me. God! An instant ago the mist opened and I caught a glimpse of the streets below. The fog is not simply vapor, it lives. By the side of each moaning and weeping human is a companion figure, an aura of strange and varicolored hues. How the shapes cling, each to a living thing. The men and women are down flat on their faces. The fog figures caress them lovingly. They are kneeling beside them. They are, but I dare not tell it. The prone and writhing bodies have been stripped of their clothing. They are being consumed piecemeal. A merciful wall of hot, steamy vapor has swept over the whole scene. I can see no more. Beneath me, the wall of vapor is changing colors. It seems to be lighted by internal fires. No, it isn't. I have made a mistake. The colors are from above, reflections from the sky. Look up, look up. The whole sky is in flames. Colors, as yet unseen by man or demon. The flames are moving. They have started to intermix. The colors rearrange themselves. They are so brilliant that my eyes burn. Yet they are a long way off. Now they have begun to swirl, to circle in and out, twisting in intricate designs and patterns. The lights are racing each with each, a kaleidoscope of unearthly brilliance. I have made a discovery. There is nothing harmful in the lights. They radiate force and friendliness, almost cheeriness. But by their very strength, they hurt. As I look, they are swinging closer and closer, 1,000,000 miles at each jump. Millions of miles with the speed of light. Aye, it is light, the quintessence of all light. Beneath it, the fog melts into a jeweled mist, radiant, rainbow-colored of 1,000 varied spectrums. I can see the streets. Why? They are filled with people. The lights are coming closer. They are all around me. I am enveloped. The message stopped abruptly. The wire to Zebico was dead beneath my eyes in the narrow circle of light from under the green lampshade. The black printing no longer spun itself, letter by letter, across the page. The room seemed filled with a solemn quiet, a silence vaguely impressive, powerful. I looked down at Morgan. His hands had dropped nervelessly at his sides, while his body had hunched over peculiarly. I turned the lampshade back, throwing the light squarely in his face. His eyes were staring fixed, filled with a sudden foreboding. I stepped beside him and called Chicago on the wire. After a second, the sounder clicked its answer. Why? But there was something wrong. Chicago was reporting that wire 2 had not been used throughout the evening. "Morgan!" I shouted. "Morgan, wake up! It isn't true! Someone has been hoaxing us. Why?" In my eagerness, I grasped him by the shoulder. It was only then that I understood. The body was quite cold. Morgan had been dead for hours. Could it be that his sensitized brain and automatic fingers had continued to record impressions even after the end? I shall never know, for I shall never again handle the night shift. Search in a world atlas discloses no town of Zebico. Whatever it was that killed John Morgan will forever remain a mystery. End of the Night Wire by H. F. Arnold.
The Terror by Alfred Coppel. Future combined with science fiction stories, November 1950. The wars of nerves, the Cold Wars of the early 20th century pale into insignificance beside the fear that besets humanity when January Carville returns from space. From Quintus Bland's History of Mankind, Chapter 24, The Terror. These are the halcyon years. The awful goad of the terror is gone, and men can look into the sky without fear. The new colonies thrive among the low red hills of Mars, in the icy moraines of Io, Europa, and Titan. Starships are poised on the outer moons. Perhaps soon Earth will wear a diadem of stars. Yet, some of the bitterness of the fear-ridden years is with us still. Forgiveness does not come easily to those who have suffered the humiliation of the terror. There are the blighted lives to remember and the unfortunates who lived and died under the threat of annihilation from the sky. January Carville's memory is accursed, for it was Carville who brought the terror. Of the man himself, little is known. He lived and died in the first decade of the conquest of space, or in the last decade of the nationalist era, since they coincide. A few short years had passed since the first successful moon flights and the establishment of the space stations, and the tensions that had been mounting among the nations of Earth were nearing the breaking point. Lunaris was moon base then, and the launching racks were pointed back toward Earth and not toward the planets. Intense activity had turned the moon into an atomic arsenal, a focal point of all the destructive arts men had learned during and since the Second World War. The old countries, mainly the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and the United States of America, stood with weapons poised. The seemingly eternal Cold War steadily growing hotter. Moon base was American, and the space stations were Russian. A parity of weapons had been reached, and jingoists cried for war. History does not record the exact date of January Carville's departure from the Earth-Moon system. It is known that he was an American, a qualified moon pilot, and a fanatic on the subject of planetary exploration. It is also known that he boarded an experimental long-range rocket bomber without authorization and vanished from the arsenal in Tycho. Some have suggested that he did not steal the craft and that he was actually ordered on his epoch-making flight, presumably in search of militarily useful information. This is unlikely. Having reached the moon and turned it into fortress, the United States lost interest in space travel. Carville chafed under the restraints placed upon him in the Bureau of Security. It is therefore more than just probable that he took it upon himself to press the cause of exploration, without authority or sanction. The result of this irresponsible course of action was predestined. Carville lost his ship and his life. But he left a legacy that was to shake the world. On the evening of January 17, 1971, some 6 years after Carville's disappearance from Moonbase, the Pacific Radar Watch detected an approaching missile. It was tracked for routine interception, and one ground-to-air missile was actually launched at it before its erratic course identified the unknown rocket as a spacecraft in distress. Fortunately, the GTA missile was caught and neutralized before interception occurred, and the approaching spacecraft was allowed to crash in the middle of California's Central Valley, near what was then the city of Fresno. January, Carvel's ship crashed and burned when he came back. Cinch crews found the wreckage, and it was immediately established as the experimental rocket bomber stolen 6 years before by January Carvel. It was badly smashed by the crash and, in addition, seemed to have sustained a considerable amount of battle damage. A charred body was removed from the rocket and identified as January Carvel. The craft's papers, however, were in an excellent state of preservation, it being indicated that Carvel sacrificed his life to protect them. These papers, consisting of some photographs, some crudely drawn planetary maps, and a diary, were contained in a steel box addressed to the Secretary of Defense. They were rushed to this official without delay. Fortunately, he was at the time in New Washington, somewhere under the Great Lakes. Within 12 hours, a meeting was held among the chiefs of state of all the Western powers. 2 hours later, a special courier plane was dispatched to Kuibyshev, the new Russian capital beyond the Urals, and the greatest joint effort in the history of mankind was begun. The terror had come too early. From the text of the President of the United States message to Marshal Vasily Kemprov, the Russian dictator, in spite of our differences. Therefore, I urgently request that you personally authorize the dispatching of qualified Russian experts to join in the scientific council now convening here to evaluate these terrifying documents. If you desire, hostages may be exchanged to assure the safety of your personnel. From the Carvel diary. I stood on the thin snowdrifts and looked westward into the setting sun. The vastness of the silent desert was red with faintly visible plumes of sand that rode high on the icy air. Above me the sky was cobalt, and the stars shone bright and unwinking. The nearer moon rode low on the horizon, almost touching the tiny disk of the sun. I was alone, as I have been since leaving Earth. Nowhere on this world is there life, but here men might live and thrive, for there is beauty and peace. Later, I have found a rich vein of uranium ore. The ship's converter will serve to refine it. I can go on. When I return, I will build a cairn to prove that one man at least was sane. Later, the landing was difficult, for the heat of the rocket blast volatilized the frozen methane under me. As I let her settle, the ship dug a pit in the glacier, and now she lies half buried in the yellowish ice. I slept and fed myself and put on a pressure suit. Outside, the cold and the black sky pressed in on me, making me afraid. It is never dark here, for the planet fills the sky like a bloated yellow balloon. In the far distance, I can see a fault in the glacier, and the black rock of this moonlet shows through. I think there is silver in the rock. It streaks it in a pattern of filigree. There is little here but the challenge of keeping alive. The cold depresses me, and the giant in the sky fills me with vertigo. I shall go on. Later, a giant ahead, and a giant behind. The blackness of space is all around me, and I grow used to it. I sleep and eat little now, and weightlessness is beginning to sicken me. I have come a long way. The system ahead shows promise later. I landed the ship on a wide plain. Rubble is everywhere. Perhaps this was once a moraine, but even the glacier is gone now. In the light of the sun, I can see a rising fault like a palisade. Some low hills and a talus flank it. Bright colors are sparkling there. I think the cliff is thick with gem deposits. Later, I do not like to leave this moonlet. It is small and friendly. The air is thin, but it makes the sky blue and not black. And that makes me think of Earth. Perhaps I should be thinking of going back. The fuel is getting low and the air in the ship is fouling. It will take a long time to reach home. Later I will go on for a little while longer. I cannot help thinking that I will be the only one of my race to ever see these worlds. It is a godlike thought, but sad. At home there is nothing but hate and thoughts of killing, a great pity. The sky could be ours if we were united. Later, God have mercy on me. I have seen the face of doom. The great cratered plain that spread out below me was lined with ships, great towering machines of war. We have waited too long, and now they have come. I am a soldier, a bad one, but still a soldier. I know the look of an invasion base when I see one. This is what I have seen. I will take pictures. I must return and warn them at home. They have so little time to prepare. Where have they come from? From the stars. They do not belong here. This tiny moonlet never gave them birth. Then whence have they come? And why I am afraid? From on the report of the UN Psychometric Evaluation Board. Careful study of the Carvel diary indicates that it is in fact authentic. Apparently, the loneliness of a protracted deep space flight shattered his mind, but his observations are in no wise to be disregarded for this reason. It is highly possible that the invasion base was the culminating cause rather than the effect of Carvel's obvious psychosis. Further investigation is most definitely called for. From the statement of Rep. L. Louis Frank, House Minority Leader, after meeting with administration officials. Unquestionably, the people must be told. From Pravda, official organ of the CP of the Suris, the authenticity of the so-called Carvel diary, at first doubted, has been established by Soviet experts. From the joint resolution of the General Assembly of the UN, the nations of the earth, in general concourse assembled, do hereby proclaim a state of grave emergency, and for the preservation of safety declare that the United Nations shall be considered a world government, with all necessary powers to command the massed armed forces of the member nations. The principle of unanimity among the major powers is indefinitely suspended, and terrible years began with the return of Carvel's ship with its dread discovery, and people dream nightly of death from the skies. From the files of the Muzny fleet of 12 spacecraft under UN authority will depart from the UN moon base for Mars, there to establish a military and scientific base. Personnel will include Hansen, white astronomer, Ivan D. Egocentric, ecologist, George Washington Lee, radiologist, Consuelo Diaz, cartographer, Jule Feldman, physicist, Kendo Higashi, psychologist. From the report of the first UN Martian expedition. Great RN watch station established and garrisoned according to Directive 2533. Bi-monthly transport service has been established between Kanalopolis settlement and Luna. Combined efforts by UNAIN and UTE armed force personnel are being made to establish satellite stations. It is strongly urged by the project committee that more personnel be sent to Mars. However, as a serious shortage of manpower has developed due to the feverish pace of the settlement's growth. Colonization may be the answer. Nowhere have the UN patrols discovered any indications of previous occupation by alien forces. Nothing resembling the invasion fleet discovered by January Carvel has been located. However, the cairn mentioned in the diary has been found, further supporting the authenticity of that document. Addendum in manuscript. Higashi suggests that the message found in the cairn confirms the original findings of the UN Psychometric Evaluation Board concerning January Carvel's sanity. From the message found written in pencil on a shipping tag in the Martian cairn built by January Carvel. Welcome, my brothers, from the founding directive of the New Yen Planetary Colonization and Development Committee. It being established that Mars and Europa are free of alien occupation. Colonization of the areas immediately surrounding the UN military and scientific bases on these planets immediately begun. From the statement of Delegate L. Louis Frank Assembly, Minority Leader to the World Press, simply because we have not yet been attacked. I stand foursquare on my record as a public servant. If I am returned to the Assembly as delegate from the Southwest area, I will continue to support the expanding military program. We cannot rest until all the habitable planets and satellites in the solar system are bases for our mighty cruisers. Only then can we be safe from this terror. From memorandum written by K. Higashi to the Psychometric Evaluation Board Subcommittee in Canalopolis, Mars, since I have been on Titan. Both here and on Io and Europa we have found cairns. Each time they contain the same message: "Welcome, my brothers." Has it occurred to any member of the board that these messages were all written after Coppel's supposed flight in panic from the place where he spotted the invasion fleet? From a memorandum to K. Higashi, base psychologist, Titan Colony. From the Secretary of the Psychometric Evaluation Board, Subcommittee in Canalopolis, Mars. It has. The pictures were fake too, were they not? From memorandum to Secretary, Psychometric Evaluation Board Subcommittee, Canalopolis, Mars, from K. Higashi, Senior Staff, Psychologist, 1st UN Triton Expedition. Yes. The pictures were taken on Titan, I think. We found a plane there similar to the one in his prints. You'll recall that the plates were all fogged conveniently by cosmic ray radiation. A little time and touching up took care of the rest. He must have been quite a natural psychologist himself, you know. He understood that people at home would just be looking for an excuse to abandon their suicidal hysteria. What he gave them was a common enemy. Had a lot of courage too, must have shot up his own ship and then wrecked himself deliberately, leaving the papers in the trail of cairns. People will hate him when they find that he made fools of them. But I don't think they'll go back to the old life of before the terror. They will find out, of course. I suggest you break it to them back home. I'd like to be there to see it, but I am too busy out here. We're building a staging base for the stars. I think Coppel would have liked that, don't you? End of the Terror by Alfred Coppel.
There is a Reaper by Charles Veuve de Vet.
Doctors had given him just 1 month to live, a month to wonder what comes afterward. There was one way to find out: ask a dead man. The amber brown of the liquor disguised the poison it held, and I watched with a smile on my lips as he drank it. There was no pity in my heart for him. He was a jackal in the jungle of life, and I was one of the carnivores. It is the lot of the jackals of life to be devoured by the carnivore. Suddenly, the contented look on his face froze into a startled stillness. I knew he was feeling the first savage twinge of the agony that was to come. He turned his head and looked at me, and I saw suddenly that he knew what I had done. "You murderer!" he cursed me, and then his body arched in the middle and his voice choked off deep in his throat. For a short minute, he sat tense, his body stiffened by the agony that rode it, unable to move a muscle. I watched the torment in his eyes build up to a crescendo of pain until the suffering became so great that it filmed his eyes, and I knew that though he still stared directly at me, he no longer saw me. Then, as suddenly as the spasm had come, the starch went out of his body and his back slid slowly down the chair edge. He landed heavily with his head resting limply against the seat of the chair, his right leg doubled up in a kind of jerk. Before he was still, I knew the time had come. "Where are you?" I asked. This moment had cost me $60,000. 3 weeks ago, the best doctors in the state had given me a month to live. And with $7 million in the bank, I couldn't buy a minute more. I accepted the doctor's decision philosophically, like the gambler that I am. But I had a plan, one which necessity had never forced me to use until now. Several years before, I had read an article about the medicine men of a certain tribe of aborigines living in the jungles at the source of the Amazon River. They had discovered a process in which the juice of a certain bush, known only to them, could be used to poison a man. Anyone subjected to this poison died, but for a few minutes after the life left his body, the medicine men could still converse with him. The subject, though ostensibly and actually dead, answered the medicine men's every question. This was their primitive, though reportedly effective method of catching glimpses of what lay in the world of death. I had conceived my idea at the time I read the article, but I had never had the need to use it until the doctors gave me a month to live. Then I spent my $60,000, and 3 weeks later, I held in my hands a small bottle of the witch doctor's fluid. The next step was to secure my victim, my collaborator. I preferred to call him, the man I chose was a nobody. A homeless, friendless, non-entity, picked up off the street. He had once been an educated man, but now he was only a bum, and, when he died, he'd never be missed. A perfect man for my experiment. I am a rich man because I have a system. The system is simple. I never make a move until I know exactly where that move will lead me. My field of operations is the stock market. I spend money unstintingly to secure the information I need before I take each step. I hire the best investigators, bribe employees, and persons in position to give me the information I want, and only when I am as certain as humanly possible that I cannot be wrong do I move. And the system never fails. $7 million in the bank is proof of that now. Knowing that I could not live, I intended to make the system work for me one last time before I died. I am a firm believer in the adage that any situation can be whipped, given prior knowledge of its coming and, of course, its attendant circumstances. For a moment, he did not answer, and I began to fear that my experiment had failed. "Where are you?" I repeated, louder and sharper this time. The small muscles about his eyes puckered with an unnormal tension, while the rest of his face held its death frost. Slowly, unnaturally, as though energized by some hyper-rational power, his lips and tongue moved. The words he spoke were clear. "I am in a tunnel," he said. "It is lighted dimly, but there is nothing for me to see." Blue veins showed through the flesh of his cheeks, like watermarks on translucent paper. He paused, and I urged, "Go on. I am alone," he said. "The realities I knew no longer exist, and I am damp and cold. All about me is a sense of gloom and dejection. It is an apprehension, an emanation so deep and real as to be almost a tangible thing. The walls to either side of me seem to be formed not of substance, but rather of the soundless cries of melancholy of spirits I cannot see. I am waiting in the gloom for something which will come to me. That need to wait is an innate part of my being, and I have no thought of questioning it." His voice died again. "What are you waiting for?" I asked. "I do not know," he said, his voice dreary with the despair of centuries of hopelessness. "I only know that I must wait. That compulsion is greater than my strength to combat." The tone of his voice changed slightly. "The tunnel about me is widening, and now the walls have receded into invisibility. The tunnel has become a plain, but the plain is as desolate, as forlorn and dreary as was the tunnel, and still I stand and wait. How long must this go on?" He fell silent again, and I was about to prompt him with another question. I could not afford to let the time run out in long silences, but abruptly the muscles about his eyes tightened, and subtly a new aspect replaced their hopeless dejection. Now they expressed a black, bottomless terror. For a moment I marveled that so small a portion of a facial anatomy could express such horror. "There is something coming toward me," he said. "A beast of brutish foulness. Beast is too inadequate a term to describe it, but I know no words to tell its form. It is an intangible and evasive thing, but very real, and it is coming closer. It has no organs of sight as I know them, but I feel that it can see me, or rather that it is aware of me with a sense sharper than vision itself. It is very near now. Oh God, the malevolence, the hate, the potentiality of awful, fearsome destructiveness. That is its very essence. And still I cannot move. The expression of terrified anticipation centered in his eyes, lessened slightly, and was replaced instantly by its former deep, deep despair. "I am no longer afraid," he said. "Why?" I interjected. "Why?" I was impatient to learn all that I could before the end came. "Because," he paused, "because it holds no threat for me. Somehow, someday, I understand, I know, that it too is seeking that for which I wait." "What is it doing now?" I asked. "It has stopped beside me, and we stand together, gazing across the stark, empty plain. Now a second awful entity with the same leashed virulence about it moves up and stands at my other side. We all three wait myself, with a dark fear of this dismal universe, my unnatural companions with patient, malicious menace. Bits of," he faltered, I can name it only aura, go out from the beasts like an acid stream and touch me, and the hate and the venom chill my body like a wave of intense cold. Now there are others of the awful breed behind me. We stand waiting for that which will come. What it is, I do not know." I could see the pallor of death creeping steadily into the last corners of his lips, and I knew that the end was not far away. Suddenly a black frustration built up within me. "What are you waiting for?" I screamed, the tenseness and the importance of this moment forcing me to lose the iron self-control upon which I have always prided myself. I knew that the answer held the secret of what I must know if I could learn that my experiment would not be in vain, and I could make whatever preparations were necessary for my own death. I had to know that answer. Think, I pleaded. "What are you waiting for?" "I do not know." The dreary despair in his eyes, sightless as they met mine, chilled me with a coldness that I felt in the marrow of my being. "I do not know," he repeated. Yes, I do know." Abruptly, the plasmatic film cleared from his eyes, and I knew that for the first time since the poison struck, he was seeing me, clearly. I sensed that this was the last moment before he left. For good, it had to be now. "Tell me, I command you," I cried. "What are you waiting for?" His voice was quiet as he murmured softly, implacably, before he was gone. "We are waiting," he said, "for you."
End of There Is a Reaper by Charles Verdevet.